My colleague Harry Berger just uploaded a video with two very important Ukrainian academics. You will find the entire video on his channel, link will be in the description. Here are the first 35 minutes. It's very much worth watching.
Just like Trump's campaign pledge to end the genocide in Gaza, Trump's promise to end our involvement in the Ukraine proxy war hasn't come true either. Though the United States continues to support that proxy war, Ukrainians increasingly do not. Recent protests in Ukraine that took place across the country prove that. I speak to two Ukrainian scholars, Ivan Katchanovski and Marta Havryshko. Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Protests broke out across Ukraine on Tuesday after President Zelenskyy signed a bill to eliminate the independence of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, also known as NABU, and its anti-corruption prosecutor's office. Now, this is a country that was considered before its war to be one of the most corrupt countries in Europe. That's what The Guardian said. And Ukraine will now administer all of its anti-corruption investigations under the direct control of the prosecutor general. This is someone who was appointed by and loyal to President Zelenskyy. And NABU, which was originally set up with help from the United States, says that the anti-corruption infrastructure in Ukraine, that it's basically been destroyed. What's the context for this move that just handicaps anti-corruption investigations in Ukraine, and what really explains the mass protests that we're seeing in response? Why is it happening now?
I think this is just the latest move by Zelensky to try to consolidate his undemocratic rule in Ukraine and to eliminate any vestiges of potential challenge to him in the form of National Anti-Corruption Bureau, which was organized and still is influenced by the United States. So he removed basically a constitutional court of Ukraine. He blocked and banned Ukrainian journalists and bloggers, very popular Ukrainian bloggers who were critical of him. He banned now 12 opposition parties. He launched investigations for state treason against potential and presidential challenges to him. So he basically tries to consolidate his undemocratic rule and to create a full-fledged dictatorship in Ukraine. And now he went against U.S. Basically influenced and U.S.-backed agency, which is also just example of a situation when Ukraine is not a truly independent state, there is no sovereignty. It's basically, as I mentioned before, Ukraine is a client state of the United States. And this agency, which is quite unique in the world, is basically was created by the United States administration to have a control and influence over Ukrainian politicians, Ukrainian government, and using corruption as a issue because Ukrainian politics is very corrupt and Ukrainian government is very corrupt. I always say that best business in Ukraine is to be in politics or in the government. So for this reason, there is such a strong backlash in the West, which happened for the first time during the Russia-Ukraine war, to have such open opposition and criticism of Zelensky by top EU officials, but also by U.S. Senator Graham, from I think who is ally of the Donald Trump, and also by leading Western mainstream media like The Economist, Wall Street Journal, and BBC and Guardian and many other media outlets who were promoting narrative of Zelensky as a hero of Ukraine, as a new Churchill, as a great Democrat. Now they basically accuse him of doing opposite. So this is quite kind of revealing what happened in Ukraine. And mass protests which took place in Ukraine is not, I think, a very large one. So this is not on a scale which can have any real possibility of removal of Zelensky. And but I think this is very significant in terms of that this happened at all, because there were no possibility of people to express any opposition in such format of mass protest, because now they are considered to be illegal. Any protest in Ukraine considered to be illegal during the martial law, And this is another way by Zelensky to limit and to eliminate any possible challenges to him. So in this case, just the fact of such demonstrations is very significant that just a sign that he's not as popular and embraced by Ukrainians as media, and he himself tried to present in order to kind of show him as a kind of supported by Ukrainians and so on. So this is, I think, a very important moment right now.
So the last time we spoke, polling had just been released, which showed that more than 50% of Ukrainians wanted an end to the war. And that was in November of 2024. And most recent estimates show that the number of Ukrainians who want a negotiated end to the conflict is even higher. We're now more than 3 years into the proxy war. What do you assess is the view of most Ukrainians at this point toward ending this conflict?
Again, since I also research public opinion polls professionally for a very long time, I commission such polls in Ukraine. But now I think it's very difficult to just check at face value public opinion poll results, especially on such important issues and politically charged issues as a peace and war in Ukraine. So I think a lot of public opinion polls actually underestimate support for a peaceful end of this war, peaceful resolution of this armed conflict in Ukraine, because even recently it was not possible to speak publicly in Ukraine in support of peace. It was regarded as a state treason, and just last year, Ukrainian bloggers who were very popular, bloggers who were not involved in any politics, they were doing some kind of fashion blogs or some kind of social media, just non-political blogs, they started to support a peaceful end of this conflict. And they were visited by security service of Ukraine. And this blogger, one of these bloggers has to issue a public apology for calling for peace in Ukraine and said that she now supports war in Ukraine until victory. And another blogger has to flee Ukraine and to go to Spain. So this is just one example of that a lot of people actually who support peace in Ukraine are not able to do this openly because they are afraid of persecution. But I think a lot of other people also cannot express their support for a peaceful resolution of this war because they just have information based on government propaganda, state television, which is controlled by Zelensky. They do not allow any opposition to him and to his policies, including his decision to continue this war without any prospect of winning this war. And so, and he even blocked YouTube channels in the West by bloggers who moved to the West because they were critical of him. So in this case, I think a lot of people just do not have information to express their views, and many of them are afraid to do this. So I think there is much bigger support for peaceful resolution of this conflict, for end of this war right now, even compared to what it was before, because it's now very clear that Ukraine is not able to defeat Russia. And I said this from the start. This was the best way for Ukraine to end this war, was to have a peaceful resolution, a peace deal which would end this conflict and would be a much better option for Ukraine than to continue this war. But for Zelensky regards war as a way for him to stay in power. And for this reason, he tries to continue this war by getting support from Trump now and trying to get new weapons and so on. Even so, this would not change the outcome of this war, but would extend this war with more casualties, with more devastation, and actually more loss of territory of Ukraine.
Because there are just so few people left in Ukraine who actually want to fight this war, the Zelensky government has employed some really brutal and violent tactics to coerce Ukrainians into military service. They've sent teams of what the New York Times called in December 2023 people snatchers, people who abduct Ukrainians off the streets and then send them to the front lines. And we're told that this war has been about defending Ukrainian democracy, but in many ways, we've actually helped to destroy Ukrainian democracy by encouraging the Zelensky government to adopt all these authoritarian tactics in service of NATO war aims like mobilization. And US officials actually told Zelensky to lower the conscription age from 25 to 18, while people like Jake Sullivan demanded that Ukraine, quote, firm up their front lines. So how has that tyrannical conscription regime escalated in Ukraine? And what role has the US and NATO played in that escalation?
Yes, I think this is just quite unprecedented to see such forced mobilization in Ukraine taking place with thousands of videos of this mobilization when men are caught on the street. They basically, by force, they often beaten, they put into buses and then are sent basically to frontline without any regard for their medical condition, without any adequate training, and a lot of them either killed, wounded, or a lot of them actually desert. There is a much significant, there is now a very large desertion from by Ukrainian forces members from frontline after they were recruited by force. According to official data from Ukrainian government, from persecution, about now 20,000 of Ukrainian force members, military force members, desert, basically abandon their units each month, which is very significant, and this has a very negative effect on the front line, on the fighting with Russia. And this was quite predictable because you cannot just force people to fight against their will, especially a war which has no possibility of, for Ukraine, any real possibility for Ukraine to be won. So for this reason, Zelensky and his government rely on such illegal and brutal and unconstitutional and basically criminal tactic to force Ukrainians into military and to fight Russia. Even this is done against their will. And this is, I think, just for me, it's very kind of difficult to watch because there is also abundance of such videos, which I also analyze in my book, which would be published very soon, about the Russia-Ukraine war and its origins. And also I post some of these videos on Facebook and on Twitter or X, but such videos appear daily. And so this is just tactic of Zelensky basically to continue this war by using Ukrainians and trying to force them into fighting this unwinnable war, because Ukrainian, actually ordinary Ukrainian men, now most of them don't want to fight this war. And Zelensky just did this with impunity. There was no criticism of him. There was no kind of, even Western media, they publish only a few articles about this tactic, and there was no criticism from Western governments and policies, and they actually encouraged him, as you mentioned, to expand mobilization age to youngest generation, to 18 years old, and from 18 years to 25 years old. And Zelensky resisted this because this would be also very unpopular. So he tried to resist this, and he, instead of this, he suggested a new voluntary mobilization or voluntary draft. He offered a lot of money for people from this age group to join Ukrainian forces in exchange for a very significant monetary reward. But only about 500 men, young men from this age group joined Ukrainian military forces, which is just another indication that this war is not popular even among Ukrainians. Ukrainian men, as particular, and also especially Ukrainians in the west of Ukraine, which is my native region of Ukraine, which is traditionally very anti-Russian region, but still people in Western Ukraine also do not want to fight this war because they also realize that this is not a winnable war, that they cannot be forced to fight into this war. But Western governments use Ukraine as a proxy to fight Russia, to weaken Russia. And this is another kind of issue which now became very clear. When I first mentioned this, that this was a proxy war, at the start of this war, it was regarded as kind of, as it was dismissed basically. Even editor of Economist said that this is basically this is not the case, and so on. They all, when I mentioned this on X or Twitter, this was regarded as kind of something false and so on. They rejected this, but now even Secretary of State and now National Security Advisor for Donald Trump, Marco Rubio, admitted this is a proxy war. And Boris Johnson, who actually was one of the people who blocked a peace deal in Istanbul, which could have ended this war in the spring of 2022, he also said that this is a proxy war in which Ukrainian forces are used by the West to, again, as a proxies.
Marco Rubio's State Department has made one of its signature policies combating what it calls anti-Semitism. And there's all sorts of new vetting procedures for visa applicants that they have based on whether or not candidates for entry criticize the foreign government of Israel. And college students who write op-ed articles critical of that foreign government and its genocide are labeled anti-Semites by the State Department and in some cases deported. Official sanctions are placed on international institutions like the ICC for supposedly targeting Israel out of anti-Semitism. And really, none of those are really cases of anti-Semitism. They're all criticisms of Israel, but the State Department acts very vigilantly against them. I just want to compare that, though, to how the State Department currently handles a case of actual anti-Semitism and actual Nazis. And that's the Azov battalion in Ukraine. And it's clear that the State Department doesn't really care about anti-Semitism at all. That's merely an excuse to achieve their desired end of censoring Israel's critics. Under Joe Biden, we removed restrictions to sell weapons to the Azov battalion, and many of whose members are actual neo-Nazis who believe in white supremacy and wear Nazi insignias into battle. Rather than combat that anti-Semitism, the State Department has funded it with millions of dollars in weapons. How significant of a presence are these neo-Nazi groups currently in the Ukraine proxy war? These neo-Nazi groups that Marco Rubio's State Department continues to support?
I think neo-Nazis are now very powerful in Ukraine, and according to my research, they are most powerful neo-Nazis in the world. Yeah, even so, Russia falsely claims that Ukraine is Nazi state, so basically Russia inflated power of neo-Nazis, but Western governments and Western media totally denied influence of neo-Nazis like Azov movement. They claim that Azov became depoliticized, they radicalized, and so on. Even so, this is not the case. And actually, they are no longer just battalion, which was initially established by Azov, neo-Nazi patriot of Ukraine movement organization. They now became a brigade, and now they expanded into corps. Like this is almost army now. So they have much bigger power and much bigger influence in Ukraine compared to what this was initially after the Maidan, in which they played very significant role by their reliance on violence and by their influence and by their ability to participate and their participation in the violent overthrow of the Yanukovych government in 2014 by the means of Maidan massacre of the police and Maidan activists. So they expanded their power, and they expanded their power because of their reliance on violence, their reliance on force. And this is why they are so powerful. They do not have any significant representation in Ukrainian politics. They are not members of Zelenskyy government now. They are not members of Ukrainian parliament right now, but they have possibility and power to influence decisions of Zelenskyy. And one of the most important decisions which Zelenskyy did after he rejected his own election promise to have peaceful resolution of this war, of the war in Donbass in 2000, which started in 2014, and he was elected on this promise in 2019. But soon after, he basically abandoned this promise because, in particular, from a threat that he would be targeted by the far right, specifically by neo-Nazi Azov movement.
I want to start actually with the censorship against you. You've been very critical of this war from the start, particularly focusing on the very influential role of these neo-Nazi groups in the proxy war effort. And as a result, there's been this massive effort to silence you. You have threats from the neo-Nazi right in Ukraine, as well as just the abandonment by your own university very recently. And there's an open letter that's signed by many high-profile academics from both the left and the right in your defense, which we'll link to in this video's description. But can you talk a little bit about your research and why it's been targeted in this way?
Thank you so much for this question. It's very also important because it's a question now. It's turned into the question of my survival, of my security, and the security of my child. So when Russia attacked Ukraine in February 2022, I actually imposed self-censorship on myself. So I was trying to avoid any criticism of Ukraine because, as many people, as many Ukrainians, I was so shocked by this invasion, and I started to concentrate on explaining to Western audience some reasons behind this war, reasons behind, for example, Russian imperialism, and the very complicated relations between Ukraine and Russia. And also, I'm a gender scholar, and I started to study sexual violence perpetrated by Russian military in Ukraine, especially in Kyiv region, Irpin, Bucha, and I listened to testimonies of many survivors, and I'm still researching this topic. So more than a year and a half after Russian full-scale invasion, I started to silence myself and avoid any criticism of Zelenskyy government and Zelenskyy power. But then I noticed that this is counterproductive because Zelenskyy is concentrated in power and he's heavily rely on neo-Nazis in Ukraine and different far-right groups. And basically, the turning point was Gate. Maybe our listeners and our viewers know it's about a Waffen-SS Division Galicia veteran who was praised and received standing ovation in Canadian Parliament in September 2023. And Zelenskyy was there, and Zelenskyy greeted him because Zelenskyy was told that this guy was a fighter for Ukraine independence and World War II veteran, and he should be acknowledged. So basically, it was made a link between his fighting for Ukraine freedom and the current fight against Russian aggression. But then it turned out that this guy was actually a Nazi collaborator, and we know this high-profile political scandal in Canada, and many people basically paid a high price and political price and reputation. But what I observed in Ukraine at the same time, at the very same time, in one of the biggest of museums in Ukraine, in Kyiv, Museum of Kyiv, one of the Azov's brigade, the Third Assault Brigade, organized a photo exhibition portraying Waffen-SS Division Galicia as national heroes. And I was so shocked by this because it was a huge event and many politicians were present there. And this exhibition was opened by the Deputy Minister of Culture, and many journalists were there and many historians were there. And no one pointed to this very problematic portrayal of Waffen-SS Division Galicia when members of this Third Assault Brigade, they portrayed basically themselves as they reconstructed those three photos. So basically not Skabeva, not Putin, by themselves compare themselves to Nazi collaborators. And when I made just a little short, very short post on my Facebook with the only one question, what are you doing, guys? You are basically facilitating Russian propaganda and wartime Russian propaganda, Kremlin propaganda about Nazis in Ukraine. Is it okay? And then I experienced this enormous wave of hate, and it was the period when these far right on different sides in different groups, they started to threaten me with violence, me and my child. They organized in state-sponsored media, in state-controlled media, they organized series of different defamation articles about me. On social media, they made several publications. So basically, they started to threaten me. But then, so it was a little bit a scandal. And I really believe that it will prevent Ukraine government from supporting this exhibition. But it turned out that Ukraine government basically printed this exhibition and brought this exhibition to Lithuania. And this very exhibition was supported by Ukraine embassy and presented by representatives of Ukraine embassy. So basically on the highest state level, they continue to promote Waffen Division Galicia, who were Nazi collaborators. And then I made a publication in one of the journal Commons, and this article is available. Everyone can read this article. So I asked, is it okay, basically, for the Ukraine, which is considered itself as a democratic state, as a forefront of the struggle against authoritarian tendencies, as a country who suffered a lot from the Holocaust? At least 8 million people died, and among them 1.5 million Jews were killed during the Holocaust and the Second World War by Nazis and their Nazi collaborators. And they ask very simple question: where are we moving? Because memory politics is not only about the past, but it's also about the present, and mostly about the present. Because we as a state, as citizens, we declare our values, what is important for us. That's why, as a Holocaust scholar, Holocaust educator, as educator on anti-Semitism and racism, I'm very concerned about all those developments in Ukraine, and I'm very vocal about this. And I'm exposing neo-Nazis in Ukraine military. I'm not happy that Ukraine nowadays in Ukraine military, in Ukraine armed forces, we have Nachtigal unit, and in Ukraine military tradition there is only one Nachtigal unit. It was organized by Abwehr, by Nazis in 1941, and it participated in Barbarossa, executed Barbarossa plan, basically attacked the Soviet Union, and then they perpetrated anti-Jewish pogroms on the territory of Ukraine. So I'm very unhappy about all these developments. I can understand who came up with this wonderful idea to create a unit within Ukraine armed forces and name it after Nazi collaborators. I'm also not very happy about the using Waffen-SS Vanguard division insignia in one of the Azov's brigade. I'm not happy that the SS bolts and the SS motto is used by Vedmedi unit in Ukraine armed forces. I'm not happy that German volunteer corps consists of open neo-Nazis nowadays integrated in Ukraine armed corps in Ukraine armed forces, in particular in Karpatska Siege. And I'm very open about this, all these developments, all this, using of Nazi symbols, a Nazi eagle, for example. I'm not happy with the collaboration, official collaboration between Svaston branding, clothing brand, and Svaston in Slavic languages in Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, and in Slavic languages. Svaston is basically swastika, and they produce so many Nazi stuff and racist stuff, and they have official collaboration with Ukraine military intelligence. So I started to be worried about all those developments and started to be very vocal about this. And what happened next? I started to receive these death threats, rape threats from different neo-Nazi groups. But I was shocked by another developments. Many of my colleagues who are staying in Ukraine, especially male colleagues, started to basically facilitate those attacks. They started to downplay those threats. They started to downplay neo-Nazis. And what is very interesting that some of them are Holocaust scholars. They study inter-ethnic violence in Ukraine, and they apply for Western grants actually to conduct their research and organize their academic activity. So they are very inconsistent with all this. On the one hand, you are applying for Western grants, relying on never again ethic in Western academia and in broader consensus in Western society regarding Nazis, but at the same time you downplay neo-Nazis in Ukraine and downplay basically those threats that I receive from them. And I'm very concerned about this. That's why I really believe that everyone who stands for free speech, academic freedom, this open letter is not only about me, it's about many of my colleagues who nowadays are persecuted by security services of Ukraine, by They feel pressure. Some of them are fired due to different reasons. For example, one of our colleagues in Cherkasy National University after Bogdan Khmelnytsky was fired because her daughter published a video on social media criticizing the crackdown on the Ukraine Orthodox Church subjected to Moscow Patriarchate. And she was fired. And it was complete silence in Western media. Nobody cared. There is no basically academic freedom in Ukraine, that so many people are subjected to pressure. They put some critical post about recent politics in Ukraine, and the next day the security service pay a visit to them, and nobody cares. Many people justify this by this existential war and all this, and all these developments. But war actually. This war, and many people say it, this war about values, this war about the future of Ukraine. And if you want really democratic future of Ukraine, you should fight for this democracy, because freedom of speech, free speech, is a cornerstone of democratic society. You can silence people. You can silence this legitimate criticism of these very troubling developments in Ukraine society. And last point, those who downplay the threats of far right in Ukraine should keep in mind that Irina Farion, a Ukraine professor, she was herself far right, basically, and she was very critical about using Russian language by Azov movement, and she was very critical about all this, and she had a very open conflict with Azov Brigade, and she was fired from her university illegally, and she then won the court and she was reestablished, and after some time she was just killed by a guy who was involved in the right sector, who participated in this semi-military activity by right sector, and who is far right himself. And in Ukraine nowadays, we have many incidents of political violence and political terrorism when people are killed. And many of those who attack them are members of far-right units with some combat experience. So basically, the same people who threatened me executed so many crimes, political crimes, and assassinations inside Ukraine. So when everyone is downplaying what I experience, they should learn more about Ukraine and political terrorism and political violence that is going on now in Ukraine nowadays when we are speaking.
Right. And as you said, the propaganda around the Azov battalion by Western media and, the United States and their NATO allies is nothing short of Orwellian. It really changed overnight in February 2022. Before the war, Western outlets and corporate media were very free to criticize the very alarming presence of neo-Nazis in Ukraine. The BBC and other Western outlets frequently denounced it, and they even implicated groups like the right sector and members of Svoboda in perpetrating the Maidan massacres, which really kicked this whole Ukraine crisis off. But suddenly, you weren't allowed to say that, and if you did, at the start of the Ukraine war, you were called a Russian apologist or a Putin lover. To underscore how significant all of this is, you posted the other day that the Ukrainian Institute of National Memory is run by this Azov veteran, Alexander Alfirov, who actually recently honored an actual Nazi from the SS Galicia division. And, I'd say that U.S. support for, Azov has been pretty consistent. We actually lifted restrictions on sending them weapons under Joe Biden in June of 2023 or 2024, if I remember. And so we've known about this presence for a while. And more than that, when the U.S. intervened in 2024, when Victoria Nuland made all those phone calls to personally appoint who would be the next prime minister right of Ukraine.
I don't think Klitsch should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
In terms of him not going into the government, just let him sort of stay out and do his political homework and stuff. I'm just thinking, in terms of sort of the process moving ahead, we want to keep the moderate Democrats together. The problem is going to be Tynybok and his guys. And, I'm sure that's part of what Yanukovych is calculating on all of this.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, what he needs is Klitsch and Tynybok on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week. I just think Klitsch going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work.
One of the people who was in that group was Oleg Tynybok and the Svoboda Party, who were openly fascist and anti-Semitic. So we really haven't cared at all about the neo-Nazi presence in Ukraine historically, and rather you could make the argument that we've supported it. So I want to ask you, how has the U.S. and its NATO allies, how have they facilitated this integration of these Nazi elements within the Ukrainian government that we're seeing so present today?
First of all, I must say that as a historian, I see so many parallels with the Cold War, because it started right after the start of the Cold War, when US, CIA, exactly from the very beginning of its establishment in 1947, and MI6, they trained Ukrainian Nazis, those members of Ukrainian Nationals Underground Movement, who were Nazi collaborators during the Second World War, who participated in the Holocaust and Nazi crimes and crimes against humanity. And all those reports, for those who are very skeptical about this knowledge and know nothing about this, I recommend visiting the CIA website, because all those documents are accessible completely. And when you, actually they are very funny, because many of those people like Bandera, Lebed, Yaroslav Stitsko, who are very prominent figures of Ukrainian nationalists at the ground and praising Ukraine's national heroes, the biggest national heroes, they are described in those documents as killers and Nazis as bastards, but our bastards, meaning, yeah, we are fully aware about their past, about their, racist views, about their anti-Semitism, but we don't care, because now they are very instrumental for our war against USSR, and they use them. They, financed Prolog publishing house in New York. It was the CIA, basically a CIA cell. They gave them documents. They protected them from persecution, from charges with Nazi collaborators. They had special documents to move freely outside US. So basically, this story is not new, and we know that during the Cold War, Western countries, especially CIA and MI6, they supported so many other, in Poland, for example, so many other nationalists, and Free Europe, for example, Radio Free Europe, who played such a great role during this Budapest uprising in '56, or this Prague Spring in '68. So they inspired people, they inspired nationalism, but they were never willing to send their troops and to protect basically those people. What we observe now is very, very similar story. US is using Ukrainian neo-Nazis and far right, like most nationalist people, in their struggle against Russia, because they knew that those people are not willing to make some compromises with Russia. They are willing to pay the ultimate goal. Many of them actually are willing to pay the ultimate goal, meaning to sacrifice their own lives even for their image of this, independent Ukraine, independent from Russia. And they are so fanatical. And this is very good for US, basically, because not US, not Great Britain, not France, not Germany, not even Poland want to send their sons, their husbands, and their brothers to the war in Ukraine. Nobody wants to observe how their loved ones are just killed by Russian drones or hunted by Russian drones.